Emily Taraoka, and I'm a park ranger here at Minidoka National Historic Site. I'm originally from California, and I'm also a descendant of Japanese American incarcerees. So this is obviously a very meaningful history for me. But I'm so glad that you were all here today to learn more about it, because it is a really important history that belongs to all Americans. And so I'm very excited to see so many people here today. So thank you very much. And then Carol, if there's anything else that we need to do, otherwise I'm happy to get started with the presentation.
If you could just adjust your screen just a bit so we can see all your pretty face.
Okay. Sorry, I'm using my colleague's computer today, so he's got a slightly different camera set up. Okay, let's, oops, not quite. Okay, maybe I can sit down a little bit or something.
Yes, that's great.
There we go. Okay, there we go. And then I will see if I can share my screen for PowerPoint presentation. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm just going to breeze through quite a bit of content here. But if you have any questions, feel free to just pop them in the chat, and then we will get to them later on. If there are any specific topics that you'd like me to go back and kind of cover a little bit more, I'm happy to do that as well. So, oh, I think if I need permission to share my screen so I can show my PowerPoint.
You do. Let me fix that.
Okay, thank you. Oh, okay. I think it's working. Not quite. Let's see. Can you see that okay? Okay.
It was up and it's there, but for some reason it shrunk a little on the screen. But
oh, okay, that's strange.
It's a kind of a view with a lot of information, including the slide things below, rather than full screen.
Oh, there's information included below?
Yeah, you're moving your.
Okay. I don't know how I got here. Okay. Maybe I can just try. Nope, that made it even smaller. Display settings. Okay, is that better?
That's
yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans in general, and then I'll get more into the specifics of Minidoka's history. To begin with, I wanted to show you all this map, just so you can kind of get an idea of what this looks like on a national scale. So as you'll notice, there's this, this red line going throughout the West Coast, and I'll kind of explain a little bit more later, but that's basically the exclusion zone where people of Japanese descent were removed from. So anyone living west of this red line on the West Coast, so throughout California, part of Arizona, part of Washington, Oregon, if you're of Japanese descent living within this area, you were one of the people, one of the thousands of people who were removed and sent to these camps. And even though we just think of maybe 10 main camps that held families, there actually was quite a large system of camps that held just people of Japanese descent. So whether they were temporary detention centers like on the West Coast, or main camps like main families, mass incarceration camps like Minidoka, maybe farm security administration camps where people might have done labor work, and as well as Department of Justice internment camps, US Army internment camps, as you see throughout here. So it's actually quite a big operation going on here. But next, before we get ahead of ourselves and, oh, wait. Okay, yes, that's fine. But before I get ahead of myself, I do want to talk a little bit about pre-war history, kind of explaining what led up to the World War II incarceration, because It helps to see the early warning signs that leads to something as massive an event as this incarceration of 120,000 people, just because of their racial identity. And so a lot of people think that the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans was due to military necessity, but that's actually not quite true. There's a congressional investigation in the 1980s that was looking into what had happened during this mass incarceration. And it determined that this was not an act of military necessity, but rather the result of racial prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership. And so we'll see how that leads up to this in just a second. So this was taken before the war. So this kind of shows how there was actually quite a bit of anti-Asian sentiment existing even before the attack on Pearl Harbor. So whether you were Japanese or Chinese or South Asian, you could be targeted for racial prejudice. And so that's kind of indicated on the sign here, where it says no JAPs or Hindus wanted. So you see this racial prejudice against Asians and Asian Americans going back to the early to mid 1800s, especially with Chinese Americans. Some of the first restrictive immigration policies were targeting Chinese immigrants, such as the the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. There are also several massacres that targeted Chinese communities in the 1800s, in the mid to late 1800s. And then you also see a wave of policies throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s that target lots of Asian American groups. So these policies could be related to marriage or immigration, citizenship even, or land ownership, and they were all designed to discriminate against Asian Americans. You also had private citizens who were forming exclusion leagues, who might be using these exclusion leagues to lobby politicians for immigration restriction, or who might be going around intimidating Asian Americans within their local community, or convincing people to boycott against Asian-owned businesses. So you see a lot of this tension building up even decades before World War II happens. And then, of course, we get to the attack on Pearl Harbor, where sadly, I think over 2,000 service members and civilians died during this attack. But people didn't really want to separate the Imperial Japanese military from Japanese Americans. And so a lot of people spread rumors that Japanese Americans were actually helping the Imperial Japanese military, even though most of those rumors were actually unfounded. But this created a general era of war hysteria, where Japanese Americans were seen as a threat to national security. There were newspapers and politicians and community leaders who sort of fueled these rumors and never really did much to dispel these myths. So you see a lot of information going around throughout the media or throughout communities saying that, oh, you can't trust Japanese Americans, we need to do something about them. And so that kind of comes to the third point of the failure of political leadership. So we had those 3 points under the congressional investigation in 1980s, whereas racial prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership. So this is a time where you really want to see political leaders step in and take responsibility and say, hey, I know that everyone is very afraid right now, and we're worried that maybe there will be an attack on the West Coast, on the mainland. But we really need to understand that we can't take this too far. We need to understand that Japanese Americans are Americans just like us, and that everyone needs to be protected as well. But unfortunately, a lot of military leaders and politicians, including President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, went with all those rumors that Japanese Americans were a threat to national security. And so President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the military to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And I believe I have it on, oh, not quite. So coming back to this map again, that's where you see that exclusion line. So this executive order allowed the military to establish this exclusion zone. And from within this exclusion zone, any person of Japanese descent had to be removed, supposedly for military necessity. And most of the people that were sent to Minidoka out here in Idaho, most of them came from the Pacific Northwest specifically. So especially the Seattle and Portland areas. And we also had a couple hundred people from Alaska as well that were shipped down to the Pacific Northwest and then brought into Minidoka as well. I'll just go into my notes here. Okay. And it's all very tragic, but I want to show that, I want to show you a few pictures of the Japanese American community before World War II happened, because you do see families in these loving homes and these thriving communities where they own businesses or farms. So you have generations of Japanese Americans that had built up a community before World War II happened. And then suddenly it's all taken away. So these images are after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And when Japanese Americans were then being rounded up from the West Coast to be sent to these camps. And they were ordered to bring only what they could carry. So you see piles of suitcases where families try to pack all their necessary belongings, whatever they can, into some makeshift bags or whatever suitcases they have available. And you also see people wearing tags. So each family was assigned a family number. And that had to be worn on each person's clothing at all times until they were being transferred to these camps. And so you're also sort of stripped of your identity, of who you are as a person, because now you just became a number. So for example, my family's number was 29521 on my dad's side, and 29590 on my dad's maternal side. So two sides of his family, they had separate family numbers. And so this is kind of the experience you see as people are being taken away from the West Coast. And this is everyone gathered at the train station to be taken to the camps. So that all their worldly belongings, all that they had gains from their businesses, from their homes, all the lives that they had built up, they had to suddenly abandon them within just a matter of a couple of weeks, maybe at the most, and condense everything into just some suitcases or some bags to be taken to these camps that they didn't know where they were located yet. So here's an image of Minidoka. So you can see the barbed wire fence, or at least part of it, as well as one of the guard towers. There were 8 guard towers surrounding the perimeter of the camp at the time. And then you can also see some of a little bit of the buildings in the background as well. So Minidoka was actually not complete by the time Japanese Americans started arriving. And so a lot of the incarcerees who were living there actually helped finish building Minidoka. So you see some Japanese Americans who are building one of the barracks or one of the structures here in the camp. But one of the major projects that was not complete for quite a while was actually the sewage treatment plant. So you can imagine how uncomfortable and potentially dangerous that could be with not having a sewage treatment plant for now thousands of people living out in the middle of the desert. And so it took about 6 months for that to be completed. And in the meantime, people had to use open pit latrines. And unfortunately, this led to a lot of diseases spreading throughout the camp, just from the lack of sanitation that they had available. This is an image of the entrance station. So this is what everyone saw when they first arrived in the camp. So I think you have some maybe employee cars that are parked out front, but essentially you would have this, this on the left-hand side, you have this partly stone, partly wooden building that was sort of a check-in station where you would have a military policeman stationed there. Actually, I think you can see him right there in the picture. You have a military policeman who is checking people's papers as they're coming in and out of the camp. So maybe administrators or visitors to the camp, everyone needs to be properly identified and examined before they go in or out. And then you also have on this right-hand side, sort of with a chimney at the top, this is sort of a waiting room for visitors if people are coming to see anyone inside the camp. Oops, too far. So then here you see one of the unique features of Minidoka is that there's a canal here. So Minidoka is actually located in very rural areas. So there's a lot of agriculture going on here. But this was actually quite brand new. So Japanese Americans actually became a big part of the agricultural legacy that now exists in this part of the Magic Valley. So initially they did have this north side canal, and that actually brought a lot of comfort to people who were incarcerated at Minidoka, because now you have around 10,000 people who were brought in from the Pacific Northwest, so maybe like Seattle or Portland, who are used to these really lush forests and beaches, very different from the desert climate that we have out here in southern Idaho. And so, so a lot of people would go down to the canal and just kind of sit by the water. It was sort of a way to mentally escape from this imprisonment that they were facing. And you actually do see the canal featured in quite a bit of the artwork from the camp. So this artwork here in the lower left-hand corner, showing two women looking out over the canal, that was painted by someone who was incarcerated here at Minidoka. And so it did become an important part of people's lives while they were incarcerated here. Here's an aerial view of Minidoka. Another thing that's unique about this camp is its shape. So most of the camps were actually a pretty square-shaped grid format, and you can kind of see some of the grid structure here in the way that blocks are lined up and all the buildings and barracks. But Minidoka pretty uniquely wraps around the Northside Canal here, so you can kind of get a larger image of the Northside Canal, and then the camp itself kind of bends around that curve to fit with the canal. And if you were to walk from one end to the other side of the camp, that's about a 3-mile walk. So it is a pretty extensive area to be covering. So I mentioned agriculture was a big part, and this is because Minidoka was actually built on Bureau of Reclamation land. So the Bureau of Reclamation, their mission since the early 1900s was to reclaim this desert landscape out here in southern Idaho and turn it into farmland. And so when they were looking for places to build these camps to hold Japanese Americans, this one place out here in Idaho was offered up, and they said, well, we need somewhere that's remote and far removed from any civilian, removed from any large populations. Especially military installations. We also need somewhere that has a railroad nearby, and there is one out here that had already been established. And we also just need a lot of land, right? And so the Bureau of Reclamation said, well, we can loan you the land for the purpose of building this camp, but in return, you need to help us continue our mission of reclaiming the desert landscape. And so Japanese Americans who were incarcerated at Minidoka were essentially used as cheap labor. They were paid, but very, very little compared to what the going rate should have been. And Japanese Americans provided labor to clear away sagebrush, help build out the irrigation ditches. They actually built the Milner-Gooding, they dug out 5 miles of the Milner-Gooding Canal by hand tools. And they also planted crops out here, and that they actually used for the purpose of sustaining the camp. And so they actually became a big part of the agriculture out here, because Minidoka, going back to the other image, so what you see here of Minidoka, of the residential portion of the camp, with all these structures and these buildings, that's maybe about 1,000 acres. But going beyond the camp, away from the Northside Canal, the entirety of the camp actually stretched out to 33,000 acres. So this was all supposed to be dedicated to reclaiming the desert landscape for the purpose of agriculture, using Japanese American labor for that. And so here we have a historic map of camp itself. And so again, so if you go from block 1 to block 44, one end of the camp to the other, that's about a 3-mile walk. Our site currently that we preserve for the National Park Service, it takes up just a small portion of that. So here we have this middle section. This is about the area, the warehouse area actually is where our visitor center is currently standing. And then we have a couple blocks here, blocks 21, 23, 22, and 24. This is the fire station out here, and I'll show you a picture of that later. And then we have a bit of this road through the administration area and up to the guard tower, which would have been located here. And so we only have a little, just a small portion of what used to be the residential section of the camp. I don't know if you can see here in the bottom right-hand corner what a typical block looks like. So this is what each of these squares contain. So if we're looking at block 44, for example, it would have 12 barracks. So 12 residential barracks where Japanese Americans would actually be have their sleeping quarters. And then in the center, you have a mess hall where about 300 people from the block would have all their meals each day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then behind the communal mess hall, you would have the bathroom facilities. So they did split up by men and women, but there wasn't much privacy in general. And I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But kind of gives you an idea of the layout of what a typical block looks like within this given map. And then here you can see an image of what the camp looks like. So these structures are the barracks, and the barracks were very hastily built. Minidoka, as an entire camp, this community of thousands of people, was built in just a matter of several months over the summer of 1942. And so they really focused on just the quantity of buildings rather than the quality of the buildings, because they needed to build around 640 buildings just within a few months. And so I'll show you a picture later, but each of these structures are a very simple wooden structure. And they use fresh green wood when they're constructed these buildings. And this wood shrank when it dried, and so it created large gaps in between the planks of wood. And the only thing covering the wood is this black tar paper that you see on the outside. And I'll show you a picture of the inside so you can kind of get an idea of how sparse this shelter is. But you can imagine there's not much to protect you from the elements out here in the southern Idaho desert, especially when we have winters that get down to below freezing levels and sweltering summers. And then you also have quite a bit of high winds coming through, so you lots of dust storms. And these buildings really do not provide that much shelter to be living in. Here's a picture inside of one of the mess halls. So you can see people who are lining up through this door on the side here to come get their food. And they have some stoves out here in the back corner. You might be able to see some people wearing these chef's hats. They're the people who are preparing the food. It is Japanese Americans who are preparing the food for each other. So designated people might be assigned or volunteered for the job of working in the mess halls. And then everyone else lines up, comes and gets their plate, and then sits down here at the picnic tables to have their meals. You also had schools in Minidoka. So there was one high school, one junior high school, and then 2 elementary schools. And so this might be either a preschool or an elementary school right here. Teachers were hired from outside of the camp and brought into the camp to teach these children. But there was actually a high turnover rate of teachers because they were often brought out to the middle of the desert and living in similar conditions to what the incarcerees were living in. And people thought it's probably not worth the pay, so I'll go find a job somewhere else. And due to this high turnover rate of teachers, they started allowing Japanese Americans who were incarcerated there, if they had college degrees, and they could also serve as teaching assistants to help with the classrooms. Japanese Americans who were incarcerated at Minidoka, despite all that they're going through, having essentially been betrayed by their country and labeled an enemy, even though they're citizens of the United States. A lot of people have lost their friends, they've lost their homes and their businesses. When they were brought out to Minidoka, they still tried to create a community to help support each other and to get through this experience, especially because they didn't know how long they would be staying here in this camp, or if they would ever even be allowed to leave. So you do see some gardens that pop up throughout the camp, whether they are vegetable gardens, like in the bottom left-hand corner there, right outside the residential barracks. People still wanted to be as patriotic as possible. during the war, and so they built victory gardens outside their barracks. And up here in the top right-hand corner, you also have some gardens just to beautify the space. And so this looks like a Japanese rock garden. And there were a couple famous landscapers from the Seattle area who built gardens out here at Minidoka. And this was just to kind of break up the monotony of that very barren desert landscape. It's just because even though it's mostly agriculture out here today, when Japanese Americans first arrived, it was just lots of sagebrush and dust and sand. And so they wanted to make their environment a little bit more comfortable to live in. Here's another image, possibly from the schools. You have a couple of teenage girls who are painting with what looks to be a teacher. So they're painting a landscape, possibly for an art class. You also had sports at Minidoka. So baseball was definitely the most popular. There are actually 14 baseball fields here at, in the camp. But if you think about it, it is quite a large area to be covering at 1,000 acres. So you don't really want to be walking a mile to go practice at a ball field and then walk a mile to get back home. It might take a while. And so there are quite a few baseball fields throughout the camp, so people could enjoy playing. And there were leagues for all different ages and genders. So you had a semi-professional team for the adults, and you also had a team for older adults, maybe 26 years and up. And you also had the high school team and children's teams and women's teams. So everyone was really fond of the sport in particular. But they also had other activities as well. So maybe volleyball and basketball. One very dedicated man built a 9-hole golf course. And because I guess if that's your passion, that's your passion. But as you can imagine, a lot of these ball fields and golf courses and volleyball courts and everything, a lot of them are very basic, very simply done, very basic level. So for example, we have a reconstructed baseball field now, and most of it is just dirt. So there's not really any grass for the outfield. It's just lots of sand. But baseball and other sports and recreational activities were really important for people's emotional well-being, because, like, again, as I said, they were dealing with incredible amount of loss and grief. Not only had they lost their friends and their livelihoods, they might have had to leave their pets behind. A lot of teenagers wrote in journals or in essays during their high school years about how they weren't sure if they had a future anymore, because they weren't sure if they were ever going to leave the camp or not. And so you have a lot of dreams that are shattered, especially for maybe the immigrant generation that had come to the United States and hoped to build a life here, and then had it all taken away from them. So in order to cope with that grief, people really needed an outlet, whether that was baseball, or if they created a community choir at the church, or if they put together art classes or dances on the weekends, just anything really to kind of distract them from their situation, and to bond together as a community and have some sort of outlet, whether it's through exercise or through creative activities. So I mentioned that Japanese Americans were working in the mess halls. So you can see down here in the bottom right-hand corner, you have a gentleman who is preparing a meal in one of the mess halls. But they also served their community in a variety of other jobs as well. So here in the top left-hand corner, you have a group of women who are standing in front of one of the fire stations that was here at Minidoka, and one of the fire engines. So this is kind of a good example of how Japanese Americans, even though they were incarcerated, they still wanted to support the war effort and still be a part of that, because as you might remember that there are women all across the country who are now stepping into roles that hadn't been available to them before, whether it's in industry or in military service. And so some women here in the camp still felt the same way. And there was And there was an opportunity for women to become firefighters when that would have been a very unusual situation otherwise. So it's kind of fun to see these Japanese American women standing in front of the fire engine in this occupation. You also have people who would be working at the warehouse area, which I pointed out on the map before. So here in the bottom right-hand corner, you have a group of men with, I think they've created some toolboxes. So this actually might be a carpentry class, but people who already have that background or that experience from before the war, they might have helped out, they might have worked as the mechanics and maybe the automotive repair warehouse, or they might have worked in the co-op store and getting supplies for the camp. There's a variety of jobs that that help sustain this camp, and it was mostly Japanese Americans who were essentially running the camp, even though they were overseen by the administration. Japanese Americans who also had medical backgrounds, whether as nurses or doctors, could also be working in the hospital they had on camp, had within the camp. And so here in the top left-hand corner, you have an image of a nurse holding a baby. There were 500 babies that were born here at Minidoka, just at this one camp. And so Japanese Americans with medical expertise might work in the hospital to assist with that. The wages for working within camps for Japanese American incarcerees, they were very much suppressed, and depending on what sort of work you were doing, you might get a different amount of pay. So for example, if you were working in agriculture, so if you're a farm labor hand who was helping clear the sagebrush or help grow the crops to sustain the food for the camp, then you might be paid $12 per month. So even in 1940 standards, that's not very much money at all. If you're doing more of a skilled work, so maybe if you're a typist or a secretary, or if you were a nurse or a mechanic, then you might be paid $16 a month. And if you're more of a professional level, so if you had experience as a lawyer or as a doctor, then you would be paid $19 a month at the very most. So again, these wages were really suppressed. They were typically about 1/4 the rates of their white counterparts, or even as much as 1/10 the rates of people outside of the camp. And then here's some images of what Minidoka looks like today. So I showed you a picture earlier of our entrance station. So on the left-hand side, we don't have the wood that completed this building anymore. So it's just a basalt rock. But you can kind of see the remains of what used to be the military police checkpoint. And then on the right-hand side with just the chimney standing up, that used to be the waiting room for visitors. We also have a reconstructed honor roll, also nearby the entrance station. And the honor roll is a replica of the one they used to, the one that they built in 1943 while the camp was still in operation. And so this honor roll commemorates the Japanese American incarcerees who were incarcerated at Minidoka, but then also served in the US military. And there's almost about 1,000 names on this honor roll. And so that's actually quite impressive that the Japanese Americans, even though they had been stripped of their civil liberties, their constitutional rights, many of them still served during World War II in the US military. So there was a segregated unit called the 442nd, and this was mostly Japanese Americans, whether from the mainland or from Hawaii, who served on the European front. And so I think they mostly fought in Italy and France, and then saw a bit of Germany towards the end of the war as well. Japanese Americans also might have served in the military intelligence service. So they might have served as translators or interpreters, or working in propaganda, or in the war trials after the end of the war. They would have been serving in the Pacific. And then here in this image in the bottom right-hand corner, you have a historic image of the honor roll, and the woman standing in front, I believe she is a member of the Women's Army Corps. And so in the top left-hand corner, you have some Japanese American soldiers who are practicing throwing grenades. So this is at a boot camp, I believe, maybe at Camp Shelby. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, you have a young soldier who has, in a way, come home. That kind of sounds like a strange thing to say because he's actually coming back to Minidoka to visit his parents who are still incarcerated here. So that again, that just shows how extraordinary the situation is that Japanese Americans, even though their families are still incarcerated, that they are serving in the military. And quite a few people from Minidoka did volunteer for military service, but many of them were actually drafted. So in 1944, the US military started drafting these young men from the camps. And that's kind of adds insult to injury after all that's already happened to them up to this point. Some of the young men did resist the draft. So we did have maybe about 36, 37 young men from Minidoka who resisted the draft and were eventually tried in court for that. I think altogether is maybe 200 or 300 across all 10 camps who did that. But this image here on the right-hand side is particularly heartbreaking, I think, because if you notice in the background on the walls of the barrack that this family has set up, you might notice that there's a banner showing 3 blue stars, so indicating that they have 3 children who are serving in the military, and then 1 gold star, indicating that one of them has died during military service. And then here we have an image of the fire station. And so this is one of the buildings that we actually still have at Minidoka. One of the historic structures that you would be able to see if you visited our site today. And so these are all the male firefighters that volunteered for this work while they were in the camp. And then here are 2 of the buildings, 2 more historic structures that we have on site. So on the left-hand side, you have one of the Mest Halls. So that's the building that would have served all the meals for the 300 or so people living within a given block. And then on the right-hand side, we have an example of one of the barracks. So one of the residential barracks where you would have had 6 families living within that one building. And I don't know if I have a map. Okay, so you have, sorry, going back to the original photo, just so you can kind of get an idea. So within this long skinny structure, you have, this building is broken up into 6 one-room apartments, and 1 family would be living in each apartment. And they did have 3 different size rooms depending on different family sizes. So I'm going to skip ahead to the next slide. On the left-hand side, you have an image of one of the smaller rooms. So that's a 16-foot by 20-foot space that would have been fit for a family of maybe 2 or 3 people. So maybe a couple or a young family. And then here you also have the entrance to the space. And this actually is the outside of the room that you see on the left-hand side. So if you went through this door, you would just turn left, and that would be the far corner of this building. And then here you see the other 2 different sizes of rooms. So from the edge of the picture up to where the door is, or what used to be the wall, that is probably the larger size room for a family of 6 to 8 people. So that would have been a 24-foot by 20-foot space. And then on the other side of the wall here, if you can kind of see it in this space over here, you would have had more of a medium-sized room fit for a family of 4 or 5 people. And that's a 20-foot by 20-foot space. So the walls on the barracks have been changed quite a bit. The buildings were taken off-site after the end of the war, and they were repurposed for, I believe the barrack was repurposed for migrant worker housing on a local farm, and then the mess hall, I believe, was sent to a fairground and used as a canning facility. So going back to this image, you'll notice that the walls look very outdated, but those are actually not the original walls that Japanese Americans would have been living with when they were living inside these buildings. So when Japanese Americans originally came to the camp, they actually looked like this. And so this is the inside of one of the walls. This is actually a fire station because it's the most original of the historic structures. And as I mentioned before, they used green wood when they were constructing all the buildings, and the green wood shrank when it dried, leaving these gaps in between the planks of wood, and also knot holes. So you can see these considerable gaps. And if you see that sort of shiny black material through the gaps, that's the tar paper that is covering the outside of the building. And so again, you'll see that there's no insulation here to trap in any heat for the icy cold winters. It's really just a bit of tar paper is kind of blocking out the wind and the snow from getting to you. And here is the outside of our historic mess hall that we have. So you can see the tar paper on the outside. And then this is inside the building. So the inside has been changed up a bit. I'm sure they probably did not have these bright green walls at the time. And we've also added some support beams just because of the age of the buildings and after being moved back and forth a couple times. But this is, as you can see, is quite a large space. It was designed to hold 300 people. You can see some examples of picnic tables in the background. And so those look like the picnic tables that people would have sat to eat at during their meals when the camp was in operation. Over here, we put up a bit of a table so you can kind of get an idea where incarcerated would have come in through the door on the side here, come up to pick up their meals. You would have had some stoves in the back corner here with people preparing the food and setting out the food on the counter for people to pick up. And then they would have gone to sit down at their picnic tables. So again, communal style of eating, kind of like a cafeteria. And then this is our visitor center. So we actually just opened that in last February. So it's pretty new. And if anyone is able to come out and visit us in person, we would love to have you. And we look forward to opening again, that's for sure. But I believe that concludes the presentation. If we would like to open up to any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Emily, there was a question, if you can see it there on the chat.
Oh, okay. Okay, what is currently on the other parts of the camp, excluding the 4 blocks you mentioned, 21 through 24? Oh, is the land still owned by the Bureau of Reclamation? After the camp closed down, because the land was owned by the Bureau of Reclamation, the Bureau of Reclamation was setting up for the Homestead Act. So after the camp closed down, it was divided into small parcels of land, maybe about 100 acres each, and returning veterans who were returning home from the war had an opportunity to start new lives as farmers. And they could put their names into a land lottery and potentially win a parcel of land along with a couple buildings for the camp, which is why we no longer have any buildings left, except for a few historic structures, because most of them had been sent out into the community. And so you can actually see them in local towns or on local farms where people used them in the post-war era. And so that's mostly private land now and private local farms outside of our boundaries.
I have some numbers questions. How many, I missed the numbers when you mentioned these. How many people in total were in camps, all of them combined?
So there were about 120,000 people who were incarcerated in the camps.
And how many were in Minidoka?
So at its peak population, there were around 9,400 people, but in total, 13,000 people actually came through Minidoka at some point during the war.
Okay. And how many were on the honor roll?
I think almost about 1,000 names are on the honor roll.
I just didn't catch all those numbers.
Oh, no worries. I think I might have forgotten to mention the 13,000. So yeah.
Their winter clothing, did they get, because I would imagine that some of the people that went there were not prepared for the cold there is, or the hot that is. How did they get seasonal clothing? Did they have to make their own, or were they given fabric, or how did they adjust to the weather?
So that initial weather in 1942, when they first arrived, it was particularly brutal. There were snowstorms as early as the first week of December, and unfortunately, there was a man who got lost in a snowstorm, and he accidentally wandered away from camp and died of exposure. But because people were so underprepared for this weather, the administration that was running the camp actually had to go find World War I surplus coats to give out to people. So pretty ill-fitting, as you can probably imagine, but it was, they were thick wool coats, and it was just anything to help keep people alive through this really brutal winter. Later on, they were able to establish a mail order system, so kind of like a Sears catalog almost. And at least people could order out for supplies that the administration did not already supply for them. So whether that's maybe toothbrushes or baby clothes, or fabric to create their own clothing as well. So at least they could order in some things into the camp.
And that was paid with the money that they earned from working.
Exactly. Yes. Some people might have had access to their bank accounts, but for most Japanese Americans, their bank accounts were unfortunately frozen because of the stigma after the attack on Pearl Harbor. But whether they were working at the camp or maybe they possibly had funding from their banks, then they might be able to pay for these materials. Yes.
Can I add one more question? Were generations
Sure.
together in the same building, you know, grandparents and parents and children, were they all in the same building or area?
I have heard of some families, at least by generation, being split up to different blocks. So maybe have parents and children in one in like block 23, for example, and then grandparents might be living in block 10. But you also might have some rooms where multiple generations are living in the same room or in the same barracks.
Okay.
Emily, I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed your presentation. It was really great.
Oh, good. Thank you.
I interned for Bob Sims at Boise State when I was
right.
studying there, and he had me read all of the Camp Minidoka newsletters that that they did. And the thing that surprised me, there were a lot of ads, oh, please come work in our fields, and advertising for the labor, but there were also downtown Twin Falls, Idaho ads wanting them to come shop. And I thought at some point they weren't 100% locked up. They were either leaving to work or apparently leaving to shop. Have you heard anything about that?
So Minidoka, I'm not sure if Minidoka is unique in this way. I haven't really heard much about the other camps doing this, but administration did, at least after a certain time, administration did allow Japanese Americans who were incarcerated in Minidoka to go into local towns like Jerome or Twin Falls and maybe do some Christmas shopping or get some supplies. They did have. There was a specific requirement. So there was this loyalty questionnaire that went around in 1943, and it went out to all Japanese Americans throughout all the different camps. And essentially the government was testing people on their loyalty, which is kind of crazy because after what's already happened to them at this point. But there are two main questions that it asked, and it said, would you be willing to serve in the military, wherever you, in active duty military service, wherever you might be sent? And will you swear allegiance only to the United States and forswear any allegiance to any other foreign entity? And this was a really complicated question for everybody because some people weren't sure, like, for example, if you're a young man who doesn't want to fight in the war, especially after what's happened to your family, maybe you would be worried that if you answered yes, then maybe that meant that you'd be drafted into the war. And unfortunately, some people were drafted. And if you were, for example, an immigrant, a Japanese immigrant, you actually did not have a pathway to citizenship. And so that second question was really difficult because you would say like, well, the US is my home now, but it won't accept me as a US citizen.
Screen
and then if I
frozen, Emily.
Oh, sorry, maybe the internet. Is it still frozen?
No, you're back.
Okay, good. Anyways, so if you are a Japanese immigrant and you don't have a pathway to citizenship, but you're also being asked to give up any connection to the country you came from in Japan, then that left you in a very scary predicament. So you weren't sure how that would go, especially during wartime when things are so uncertain. But after this questionnaire sorted out sort of who was loyal and who was not, if you were deemed loyal by this questionnaire given by the government, then you did get certain privileges. So for example, you could volunteer for military service again, which had been denied after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then at least at Minidoka, some people had the ability to leave the camp and go into the towns, at least for a day trip. They couldn't stay extensively, but maybe they could at least do some shopping in town and then come back at the end of the day.
How long were they housed there at Minidoka?
So Minidoka as a camp operated from August 1942 to October 1945. So a little over 3 years. And then before people were brought out to Minidoka, they were also held in temporary detention centers on the West Coast. So for example, if you were from Seattle originally, you might have been held at the Puyallup Fairgrounds for a few months while Minidoka was being built, and then they transferred you out to Minidoka.
We have another question on the chat. Where did the Minidoka Japanese Americans go after release?
Yeah, great question. So I think it was about 50-50 in the first few years after the end of the war. So half of people who were incarcerated either might have stayed in the area around the camps. So for example, some people from Minidoka might have stayed in Twin Falls because there was a farm labor camp and they could get some money straight after the end of the war. Some people might have decided to move east, maybe to Chicago or to the East Coast, because they thought, well, clearly the West Coast doesn't want me, so maybe I'll try my luck somewhere else, and I don't really have anything to go back to anymore. Some people try to at least return, if not to their homes, at least to their hometowns back on the West Coast. But I think within about 10 years, most Japanese Americans eventually migrated back to the West Coast after the end of the war.
And then the last question on the chat. Do you have outreach to schools to educate children about what went on at Minidoka?
We do. My former supervisor, Hanako Wakatsuki, she actually just left for another position in Hawaii. But I know that she was very passionate about doing outreach to the locals communities. And so we've actually been inundated with calls in the last couple of weeks, just asking for tours for school groups to come out and visit our site. So we're really pleased with that. And we're glad that so many educators are interested in bringing students to learn not only about this major national event, but also about their own local history in Idaho. I think there's a question from David.
Yes.
Yes, I just kind of like to make a comment and hope that you don't do what we did. It's kind of confusing. Minidoka internment camp. There's also a city called Minidoka, and we went there first.
Oh no!
That was it. So quite a ways away from the actual camp. So just so everybody knows, they go down there. Don't make the same mistake we did. You probably won't.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for that. We actually have had quite a few people go to the Minidoka National Wildlife Refuge instead of Minidoka National Historic Site. So the funny thing about the name is that it was all because of the Bureau of Reclamation. So this was known as the Minidoka Irrigation Project. And it stretched throughout the southern Idaho area from here in Drum County out to Minidoka County. And so that's why you have the similarity in names. And so to account for that, you were able to get mail delivered out to the camp itself. And so in order to distinguish between the two different Minidokas, they actually called the camp Hunt Camp. So Hunt became the postal designation, so they wouldn't get the mail confused.
I lived in Burley for quite some time and was able to work with one of the physicians that had been at the camp, and also two RNs that became very close friends, and they were excellent and so grateful they chose to stay in our community.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Let's see if there's any other questions in the chat.
Is the center open now to the public?
So we will not be opening up our visitor center until the end of May. I believe the exact date is Friday, May 28th. So that's Memorial Day weekend. And we are hoping to be open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays throughout the summer. We're just trying to figure out some our staffing capacities. So if there are any changes to that expectation, then we'll make updates on our website, or you can always call into our office and we can tell you right there. Our hours are typically from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and we hope to be holding tours around the historic structures at 11 a.m.
And then 2 more in the chat. Will you please share your email, Emily?
Oh, sure. Yes. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, if you want to email me any more questions or if you'd like any resources, I can provide you. Oh, I believe there's another question, sorry. I remember when some Japanese Americans were compensated, do you know the average each family received? Yeah, so that was as a result of the Civil Liberties Act in 1988. And so each living survivor that had been incarcerated in the camps was given $20,000 per person. So unfortunately that didn't go to descendants. And it was only for people who were still living by 1988. But it was $20,000 per person.
And then you've got a couple of other comments in your chat as a teacher. You see that one? I recommended Dust of Eden to my students.
Oh, right. I think I have heard of that one. So I'll have to make a note of that and remember that. Thank you.
And also someone says Farewell to Manzanar is also a good read.
Yes, we actually saw that one in our bookstores. Yeah, all great reads. And I'm so glad that there's actually quite a bit of literature out there that talks about the subject. So it's really wonderful.
Can you give us the exact location of where the camp is located?
Sure. Let's see. If I can remember let's see if I can. We used to have one address, and then when we got our new visitor center, we opened up another address. So let me look that up really quick for you. And then you can just type that into your GPS. Okay, so 1428 Hunt Road, and I'll type that in the chat as well. And we are in Jerome, Idaho. Oh, sorry, that was the direct message. I meant to. Okay, so let me try that again and give that to everybody. I don't know how that did that. Okay, everyone in meeting and paste. And then I'll do my email again. Okay, there we go. Oh, thank you for all the comments.
It's been a wonderful presentation. Are there any more comments or questions? If not, we want to thank you so much. This is thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Carol, for helping me set this up. And then I believe her name was Shenna, maybe. I think she also, she also helped me kind of prepare and understand how to do PowerPoint on Zoom. So thank you all for your help in that.
All right.
Thank you very much.